Ever catch yourself like flipping through a magazine, scrolling online, and it's all these ads, right? Promising you like the secret to being your best self.
Oh, yeah.
It's a whole industry, right? But what if, and stick with me here, what if we've had it backward this whole time? What if discovering who we really are isn't about like self-help hacks or finding the perfect Instagram filter? Today's deep dive, we're ditching the self-help aisle and going straight to, the source that claims to know us best.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
We're talking about the Bible, specifically this message about Psalm 139 and how it completely reframes this whole discovering your true identity thing.
So not just another self-help deep dive then?
Nope. This is about going deeper, way deeper. Because this psalm, it's like intense. It's raw, honest.
And how did that help us figure out, who we are?
It's less about figuring it out ourselves and more about letting go of all the noise, the expectations, and just sitting with this idea of how does God see us?
That's a different kind of mirror to look in.
Right. And we're lucky enough to have an expert along to guide us.
Well, I don't know about expert, but I do find this whole idea of identity in the Bible, it's fascinating.
Totally. So to kick things off, I got to ask, when you hear Psalm 139, what comes to mind?
Honestly, it's one of those parts of the Bible that kind of feels almost too personal. Like God's got you under a microscope.
Oh, tell me about it. There's this one verse 13, it says, "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb." Knitted, with needles. That's a level of detail I wasn't prepared for.
Right. And it makes you think, if God's that intentional about how we're put together, down to the tiniest detail.
There's got to be a bigger plan, right?
Exactly. And that's where verse 16 comes in. It says, "Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them."
So hold on. We're talking pre-life plans here, like a blueprint, but for our lives.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
It's suggesting that God had a purpose in mind for us before we even took our first breath.
Okay, now my brain's going a mile a minute here because if that's true, then all those times I messed up, made the wrong choice. That was part of the plan.
That's where this message gets really interesting. It's not about justifying our mistakes or saying everything we do is perfect, but it does make you rethink those mistakes.
How?
Well, what if instead of letting those past experiences define us, we looked at them through this lens of okay, God still used that. I learned something. I grew. It's our value isn't determined by those moments, by some scorecard of successes and failures.
So it's those failures, maybe they're not failures at all in God's eyes.
Exactly. It's a total perspective shift. And I'll be honest, it's not always easy to wrap your head around.
No kidding. Especially when life throws those curveballs and you're like, okay, God, I'm not sure I signed up for this part of the plan.
Oh, absolutely. But that's where faith comes in, right?
Yeah.
It's about choosing to believe what God says about us, about his love for us, even when we don't have all the answers, even when it doesn't make sense.
So how do we do that? How do we bridge that gap between how we see ourselves often, not so great, and how God sees us, especially when, self-doubt creeps in?
It's a conscious choice.
Yeah.
A choice to focus on what God says about us instead of listening to that inner critic, those voices that tell us we're not enough. And that takes practice.
So it's a process like anything else worth doing.
Exactly. And what's cool is that this psalm, it doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. It acknowledges that we doubt, we question, we get scared. And it's in those moments, those raw, honest places that we can actually encounter God's love in a really powerful way.
Okay, now that's something I can get behind.
Me too. And, that's where the sermon we're exploring dives even deeper into this whole idea of discovering our true identity.
Mm-hmm.
It's taking this foundation we've laid with Psalm 139 and then building on it brick by brick.
Okay, I am so ready to start building. So it's we're not just handed this new identity, right? It's something we have to actively step into. But how do we actually do that? Where do we even start?
Well, the pastor in this message, he used this phrase that really stuck with me. He said, "Gratitude is the gateway to transformation."
Okay, I like that. So gratitude, not just for the good things in life, but gratitude for who God created us to be.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that even our quirks, the things we might see as imperfections, they're part of what makes us uniquely us. And when we can approach those things with gratitude, it changes our whole perspective.
It's instead of trying to erase those parts of ourselves, we're embracing them.
Yes. And not just embracing them, but like you said, being grateful for them. Because often those are the very things that God uses to make our lives interesting, to connect us with others, to fulfill our purpose.
Which reminds me, this whole idea of purpose, it's something we like toss around a lot, but this message, it kind of reframed it for me. It's not necessarily about like finding that one big thing we're meant to do,
Right.
right?
It's less about like a job title or a platform and more about how we're living out our faith in our everyday lives.
So it's about those small, seemingly insignificant acts of service, of love, of just like showing up as ourselves, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like this quote I heard once, don't despise the small beginnings, because often it's in those quiet behind the scenes moments that God is doing his greatest work.
I love that. And it makes me think about all the times I've like downplayed my own gifts, you know?
No.
Thinking, oh, that's nothing special, or someone else could do it better.
Oh, I think we've all been there. But the truth is, we each have something unique to offer. And when we hold back, when we let fear or insecurity keep us from using our gifts, well, we're not just doing ourselves a disservice, but the world around us.
It's like we're robbing ourselves and everyone else of the blessing of what God could do through us.
Exactly. And, the pastor in this message, he made this really interesting point. He said that often the things we're most self-conscious about, the things we try to hide, those are the very things that God can use to reach others.
Okay, that's really powerful. It makes me think about Moses, you know? Like the guy stuttered, and God chose him to lead his people out of Egypt.
Exactly. And think about Paul, right? He talked about this thorn in his side, this weakness that he begged God to take away. But instead of removing it, God said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness."
So it's like what we perceive as our weaknesses can actually become our greatest strengths.
When we surrender them to God, absolutely. And not just surrender them, but like embrace them, see them as part of the unique way God designed us.
That's huge because it means like we don't have to have it all figured out. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to be willing to show up and let God use us, flaws and all.
And that takes a lot of trust, right? Like trusting that God's plan is bigger than our insecurities, bigger than our past mistakes.
It's almost like we have to like loosen our grip on our own definition of who we are and allow God to redefine us. But that's terrifying.
It can be, but it's also incredibly freeing. Because when we let go of that need to control everything, to prove ourselves, that's when we're truly free to step into the fullness of who God created us to be.
So how do we cultivate that kind of trust, especially when like life throws those curveballs and we start to doubt everything, including ourselves?
It's a daily practice, honestly. A daily choice to align our thoughts and our beliefs with what God says about us.
Which brings us back to that word from earlier, gratitude, right?
Yeah.
Like if we can approach each day with a grateful heart, acknowledging that God is in control, that he's got this, that takes some of the pressure off of us, right?
Absolutely. Gratitude shifts our focus from what we lack to what we have. It reminds us that we're not defined by our circumstances, by our failures, or even our successes. We're defined by whose we are.
Yeah.
Children of God, loved and cherished beyond measure.
So much easier said than done, though, right? Like, how do we actually flip that switch in our brains when that little voice starts whispering, you're not good enough, or you'll never measure up?
It's like we need to retrain our thinking, right? Like catch those negative thoughts before they take root and replace them with something, well, truer.
But what's the something truer? Is it just like positive affirmations? Because I've tried that and it feels kind of, well, fake.
It's deeper than just like slap it on a happy face. It's about going back to the source of truth, reminding ourselves of what God says about us.
Which is where Psalm 139 comes in again, right?
Exactly. Like that whole fearfully and wonderfully made thing. That's not just a nice sentiment. It's truth. And when we start to internalize that, to really believe it on a gut level, it changes how we see ourselves, how we interact with the world.
So it's like we have to preach truth to ourselves, especially when we don't feel it.
Preach it. Shout it from the rooftops. Because the more we hear it, the more we start to believe it. And the more we believe it, the more it becomes a part of us.
I can see how that would be powerful, like rewiring our brains to focus on the truth of who God says we are instead of getting stuck in those negative thought patterns. But what about those times when we mess up?
Right.
When we make mistakes? Because let's face it, we all do. Does that mean we're back to square one, trying to earn back our worth?
Not at all. See, that's the beauty of grace,
Right.
It's not about being perfect. It's about being loved and accepted, flaws and all.
Okay, that's huge. Because it means those mistakes, those failures, they don't define us.
Exactly. They're just part of the journey, opportunities to learn and grow.
And to extend ourselves some grace, right? Like, we can't expect to be perfect if we don't even offer ourselves the same grace that God offers us freely.
100%. It's like, imagine offering grace to a friend who's struggling. We'd be quick to reassure them, remind them of their worth. We need to do the same for ourselves.
Treat ourselves like we'd treat someone we love.
Exactly. With kindness, compassion, and a whole lot of grace.
This has been, like, eye-opening. So much to think about, unpack, and, well, put into practice. What would you say is, like, the most important takeaway from all of this?
Honestly, it's that our identity, our true worth, it's not something we have to earn or achieve. It's a gift given freely to us by God. And when we finally grasp that, when we really let it sink in, it changes everything.
Like, we can finally exhale, you know?
Exactly. And from that place of peace, of security, that's when we're truly free to live out our purpose, to embrace the unique and beautiful individuals God created us to be.
So good. And for those listening who are ready to dive deeper into this whole idea of identity, of discovering who they are in Christ, where should they start?
Start with Psalm 139. Really sit with it. Let those words wash over you. Talk to God. Be honest about your doubts and fears. And then listen. Listen for his voice, his guidance, his love.
Simple but powerful. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. It's been, well, amazing.
The best kind of deep dive.
Until next time, remember, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. And don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you otherwise.